years ago, when the only people who lived here were the Indians, and according to David Tate's journal, the fire was so thick around the marshland of the Tallassee River below the Tallassee Falls that if and when the fire were fighting and flew, the sky turned black. Game was so plentiful, there was no excuse for hunger. White men came to this area to settle, and with the white men came dreams. And after seeing the fertile lands and the river with its force, and the river rock, and the longleaf pine, the property almost for the taking, and human labor that could be bought cheaper than the mules and horses and oxen of that day. Having all the above ingredients, the dreams of these men grew stronger and stronger. Why not build a textile plant, a mill to use, manufacture products from cotton that was so easily grown in the area? People would buy the rope, the cloth, and all the other items that could be had from cotton. So they set out to harness the power that came from the river to use the materials such as rock and lumber to build the structures that would house the cotton mill. Teaching the laborers how to carve and chisel the stone, to move it and arrange it to form the first buildings must have been a monumental task. As you can imagine, building these buildings that you see without the help of the great earth movers, cranes, explosives, electrical tools, lights, motor-operated vehicles, computers, engineers, draftsmen, and all the many things we have at our fingertips today. They had none of these. There will be many things that you will not see. The many hours, days, weeks, and months of digging and measuring into the bedrock to make the caves and the cellars to house the water wheels and the tunnels to allow the water to rush in and escape when not needed. How to tame the forces of the river and make the water do the job. Who made the wheels? Who figured out the sizes and the structures of the machinery? After all, this is a new type of industry starting out here on the banks of the Tallassee River. The cotton gin itself is a new device, just discovered and put into use in Prattville, Alabama, some 40 miles away. A lot of the simplest items, such as a nail, a bolt, or peg, were made on the spot when needed. Can you just imagine how it must have been? All the houses had to be nearby because of the lack of transportation. The meals were cooked on the mill site, the blacksmith shops, the sawmills, quarry workers, livery stables, loggers, rock masons, carpenters, draftsmen, and so much more to make up the workforce. According to historical records, drunkenness was always a problem and fights were frequent. A man was old before he was 50, and children went to work as soon as they were big enough, regardless of their age. But sooner or later, the mill and all the subsequent buildings were ready and operational. Along with this came the Civil War, and cloth became more important than ever. And along with the cotton mill, an arsenal and an armory was needed, a place to build rifles. Carville, and many other surrounding cemeteries. The local men rallied to the cause, a lot of them using weapons made here at home. The rifles made their way to battles in Tennessee, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, and as far away as Virginia. With the making of the rifles, many stories, some true, some fiction, and some a mixture of both, came out of the mill and the armory that joined it. As we look at the arsenal, history tells us that this armory got an order for 1,000 rifles. The men got busy and started making the rifles here in this building you're looking at. The stocks were going to be made in Albany or Macon, Georgia, and shipped to the city of Tallassee. The stocks never arrived. The men's pay never arrived. The men were getting more and more frustrated and aggravated. There was a tavern on top of the hill above the mill. They enjoyed spending their time there grumbling about not being paid. History also records that monies did come, some monies came to these men. Then someone came up with the idea, why don't we make our own stocks? They started making their own stocks. Then there is a record of some of the stocks arriving in this area and being assembled to the rifles. News came that the federal troops were marching this way. The men had orders to pack up the rifles and deliver them to Georgia. We know that they packed them in beef tallow. We know they wrapped them in skins. That's where history quits recording. Some say they loaded them on wagons. These wagons got destroyed by the rivers and streams and one thing and another on the way to Georgia. Others say they are buried in this area. And till today, people still search for those rifles. There's a few rifles remaining that were made in the Tallassee Armory. Just a few feet from here is a spring that people drank from. And from that came the legend, if you ever drink water from this spring, you'll always try to come back to Tallassee. You can't get it out of your mind. You'll always try to come back. And so many visitors have come through here. And that spring still exists, but it's covered today. Maybe someday it'll be uncovered again, so that all who come by can drink from the spring that makes you return. The one thing that continues in time, and time brings on wars, World War I and the war effort, World War II, and the great national contribution from the mills in this area. Then there was the closing of the mill and the mill works. Now, let's look at the future and see what it holds. As you remember, I told you of the men who came here with their dreams. These men are here again, with those dreams again. Some 150 years after this mill was first started. Where will those dreams take us now? Hotels? Condominiums? Resorts? Manufacturing plants? Housing for the elderly? All of these things are limited only to the dreams of industrious men and women. Even though the mill number 1 story says it starts in 1844. Well, let's go back to the year 1540 as you watch some scenes that were taken of mill number 1. The early history of Tallassee opens in the year 1540 with the history of the white man in Alabama. So far as we know, the first white man to set foot on the soil of Alabama was the famous Spanish explorer and adventurer De Soto, who explored a large portion of the southern part of this country, east of the Mississippi River in search of gold. De Soto's line of march brought him to the neighborhood of Tallassee on the 18th day of September in 1540. At this time, Tallassee was a fortified village of an Indian tribe called the Tallassees and stood on the site of the present Tucabachi. De Soto and his army remained in this vicinity for 14 days, leaving this place on the 2nd day of October, having overstayed his welcome just 14 days and taken with him a number of Tallassees as slaves. For nearly 2 centuries thereafter, nothing is known of Tallassee to distinguish it from innumerable other Indian villages along the Tallapoosa River. When early in the 18th century, a northern tribe, the Tuckabatches, were conquered by the Iroquois and the Huron Indians, they migrated southward and dispossessed the more peaceable Tallassees of their village, which they rebuilt and called Tucabachi. This village later became the capital of the southern part of the Great Creek Confederacy, which included, beside the Tallassees and Tuckabatches, numerous tribes in this section of the country, such as the Sagahatchees, the Tumpkahatchees, the Wallahatchees, and many more. What is known as the modern Indian town of Tallassee was afterward built on the opposite side of the river. After this, the history of Tallassee for more than a century is again lost in obscurity. During that time, the Spaniards, the French, and the English in turn claimed or disputed the possession of what is now called the state of Alabama. In the year 1811, the famous Indian chief Tecumseh visited Tallassee, or Tuckabachi as it was now called, on his mission of forming a confederacy of the Indians in this country to attack the white settlers. The Tuckabatches were friendly to the whites, and it is related that Tecumseh, after having tried in vain for several days to induce them to join the alliance, suddenly cried out in a burst of rage, "When I get back to Detroit, I will shake my foot upon the ground and shake down every house in Tuckabachi." A month after Tecumseh's departure, an earthquake really did occur, and the credulous Indians believed it was caused by Tecumseh shaking his foot. The war that subsequently broke out between the whites and the Creeks is known as the Creek War. It resulted disastrously for the Creeks. On the 27th day of March, 1814, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, a few miles above Tallassee, General Andrew Jackson utterly defeated the Creeks and their allies under William Rutherford, or Red Eagle as we know him, and forever ended the power of the Creek Confederacy. It was found impossible then for the two races to live together peaceably, and in the year 1832 a treaty was made with the Creeks by which the Creek Indians ceded, for the sum of $210,000, and land in the Indian Territory. They gave away all of their lands east of the Mississippi for that pittance of money. In the year 1836, they were finally removed to Indian Territory, and here, as the red man turns his face towards the setting sun, we will leave him for the dawn of the white man's Tallassee. It is now at hand. Sometime prior to the removal of the Indians, a young French-Canadian soldier, a trader, named Brant Dubose, had settled in the territory that is now Tallassee, and he married a Creek woman named Millie. Their graves are located in what is now known as the Wall Street area. When the Indians moved to the Indian Territory, this land became his property by grant and deed. The old Dubose home is, the evidence of it is still in the Tallassee area, a mute witness of the changes of a century. It is on the bluff overlooking the eastern bank of the Tallassee River. At one time it was used as a community hospital. Now just a portion of it remains in that one spot, but you can still see some of the groundwork if you look close enough. Brant Dubose died sometimes between the years 1847 and 1851 and was survived by his wife and 4 children, William, Sam, Brant Jr., and Rachel. His wife continued to live in Tallassee for many years, but in 1890 she moved to the Indian Territory to be with her people and died there the following year. William and Sam Dubose served in the Confederate Army and died shortly after the close of the Civil War. Brant Jr. moved to the Indian Territory and died there between the years of 1895 and 1900. The daughter of Brant Dubose married a man named Smith. Both she and her husband have long been dead, but those dates are not available. From the elder Dubose was purchased the necessary land and water power, and the year 1844 marked the manufacture of the first cotton goods in Tallassee. Just 300 and some odd years after the first white men visited Alabama, and just 12 years after the building of the first cotton mill in the state. By the way, the first cotton mill in the state was the Bell Cotton Mill, erected in Madison County in the year 1832. The equipment of the first Tallassee mills was 1,000 spindles and 40 looms, with machinery for bleaching and for dyeing. From this humble beginning by Brant Marks, some 100 and some odd years ago, has grown the present Tallassee Mills. As the first mill failed to meet the expectations of its projectors after it had been in operations for 2 or 3 years, plans were laid to build another mill next to it. Additional land, additional water were purchased from Dubose, preparatory to the building, and in 1854, what is now known as the main mill, or mill number 1, was built. As originally built, this was a 4-story building in the shape of the letter T, with a parapet wall and comparatively flat roof. At a later date, another story was added and a sloping roof was put on. At this time, the owners were known as Barnett, Gilmer, and Company. Later, and throughout the period of the war, they were known as Barnett, McCoo and Company. McCoo was the president of the company, and at one time there was a street in Tallassee named after McCoo. There are still streets named after Barnett and Gilmer in the town of Tallassee. The company had its own store, its own sawmill, its own grist mill, its own foundry, and also its blacksmith shop. The mill supplies and its manufactured products were hauled to and from Wetumpka, which was about 21 miles away, or down to Coal Station, 7 miles distance. At the time of the building of the Tallassee-Montgomery Railway in 1896, it required 50 miles to do the necessary hauling for the mills. For a long time, Tallassee was known as Newtown. Old Town, or Old Tallassee, was on the river about a mile below this place, and an old covered bridge crossed the river at the place of the newer town of Tallassee. Old Tallassee was deserted after the collapsing in 1863 of that bridge, and the bridge at the newer town of Tallassee fell during the year 1866, 3 years later, and was not replaced until the building in 1895 of the bridge that was destroyed by the flood in 1919. Well, we've reached the stormy period of the Civil War. Tallassee's part in that conflict will be briefly given, because the building you're looking at now, the room you're looking at now, was an arsenal and an armory where they built the carbine rifles.